A flight attendant stops a young black girl as she walks to her seat. He looks at her up and down, frowns, and says, "Sweetie, I think you're in the wrong place." She blinks, confused. She has a first-class ticket, but he doesn't believe her. He laughs, waves her off, but moments later, his face turns pale. His hands shake, and when he finds out who her mother is, it's already too late. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe this twist. Maya Carter stood in the aisle, gripping her ticket, her heart pounding. She had traveled plenty of times before, but this was her first time flying first class. A gift from her mother for her 18th birthday. She had just graduated high school with honors, and this trip was supposed to be a celebration. She adjusted her hoodie, tucking her curly hair behind her ear, as she looked down at her boarding pass again. Seat 3A, first class. She was in the right place, but the flight attendant blocking her path didn't seem to think so. Greg Johnson had been working in first class for years. He knew the usual type: businessmen in expensive suits, older couples heading on luxury vacations, polished travelers who looked like they belonged, and Maya, she didn't fit that image. He gave her a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss, I think you might be confused. Economy boarding is toward the back." Maya hesitated, glancing at her ticket. "No, I'm in 3A. Greg let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "First class is a bit pricey, sweetheart. Are you sure this isn't your parents' ticket?" A few nearby passengers looked up. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A woman 2 rows ahead shifted in her seat, sensing the tension. Maya's stomach twisted. She had been so excited for this trip, but now, embarrassment burned through her. She cleared her throat. "My mom paid for this seat." Greg folded his arms. "That's nice, but I think I should check with the front desk." Maya's grip tightened on her ticket. She had done nothing wrong, but now she was being treated like a problem. And in just a few moments, Greg was going to regret every word. Maya stood there, gripping her ticket, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's no mistake. My seat is in first class." Greg Johnson wasn't convinced. He gave a small, forced smile, but his tone stayed firm. "Look, I understand, but first class is for premium passengers. Maybe your ticket got mixed up." Maya's fingers curled around the edges of her ticket. She knew exactly what was happening. He didn't believe she belonged here. He hadn't checked her ticket, hadn't asked for her name, just assumed. Passengers around them were watching now. A man in a suit raised an eyebrow. A woman across the aisle exchanged glances with her husband. The energy in the cabin was shifting. Maya took a deep breath. "You still haven't looked at my ticket." Greg let out a soft chuckle like she was being difficult for no reason. "Okay," he said, taking it from her hands. His eyes skimmed over the details, his confidence still intact, until he saw it. Seat 3A, first class, paid in full. For a moment his expression flickered. He hesitated, almost as if his brain couldn't register what he was seeing. He glanced up at her, then back at the ticket, then back at her again. Maya crossed her arms. "See? I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Greg straightened his posture, still not ready to admit his mistake. "Well, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't an issue." Maya's jaw clenched. "Did you do this with everyone else who boarded?" Silence. Greg glanced around, realizing too late that people were listening. A few passengers whispered. Someone in row 4 pulled out their phone, recording. A flight attendant near the cockpit looked over, sensing the tension. She was younger, maybe in her late 20s, and her eyes darted between Greg and Maya. "Is everything okay?" Maya turned to her, her voice calm but firm. "I showed him my ticket, and he still told me I didn't belong here." The young flight attendant frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Greg?" Greg forced a smile, trying to maintain control of the situation. I was just clarifying. Clarifying what? Maya shot back. I handed you my ticket, and you assumed it was a mistake. Greg's lips parted, but before he could respond, a voice cut through the air. Is there a problem here? The entire cabin turned toward the first-class entrance. A tall woman in a navy blue suit stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she moved with quiet confidence. Her hair was neatly styled, her posture strong. Maya exhaled. Her mother had arrived. Greg's entire body went stiff. He didn't know who she was yet, but something in her presence made him uneasy. She walked straight to Maya's side and placed a hand on her shoulder. I heard my daughter's name, she said smoothly. What seems to be the issue? Greg swallowed. I was just making sure there wasn't an error with the ticket. The woman arched an eyebrow. An error? Greg's voice wavered slightly. I just needed to confirm that she was supposed to be in first class. Maya's mother tilted her head. And did you confirm that with anyone else? Or just her? Greg's face burned red. He could feel the weight of every passenger's eyes on him. It's standard protocol. No, it's not. Maya's mother interrupted, her voice steady. I fly often. I've never been questioned like this, and I highly doubt any of the other passengers here were either. Greg opened his mouth, but she continued before he could speak. You looked at my daughter and assumed she was in the wrong place. You didn't check her ticket before telling her to move. That wasn't standard protocol. That was bias. A hush fell over the cabin. Greg's throat went dry. He had no defense. And then it happened. The businessman who had been watching earlier spoke up. She's right. I boarded right before her. He didn't ask me anything. A woman in row 2 nodded. Same here. I walked straight in. No questions. More murmurs. More whispers. The reality of the situation was crashing down on Greg, and he knew it. Then, a new voice entered the conversation. A deep, commanding voice. Senator Carter, is there an issue here? Greg's heart stopped. Senator? His mouth went dry as he slowly looked up at Maya's mother, the woman standing tall and unshaken in front of him. His breath hitched as the realization hit him like a brick. Maya Carter wasn't just some teenage girl flying first class. Her mother was Senator Evelyn Carter, one of the most respected political figures in the country, a woman with real power, real influence, and now a front-row seat to his humiliation. Greg's hands trembled slightly. His voice cracked when he spoke. I didn't know. That's the problem, the senator cut in. You didn't know, but you assumed. Greg felt like the walls were closing in. His colleagues watched silently. The passengers waited for what would happen next. The young flight attendant near the cockpit looked horrified. Senator Carter exhaled. I don't need an apology. I don't need excuses. But I will be filing a complaint with the airline. Greg's stomach dropped. She turned to the younger flight attendant. I'd like to speak with the manager before this flight takes off. The young woman nodded quickly and disappeared down the aisle. Greg felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He wanted to fix this, to take it all back, but it was too late. Senator Carter looked at her daughter and gave her a reassuring nod. Then she turned back to Greg, her voice unwavering. Next time, think before you act. Greg stood there, frozen, as Maya and her mother took their seats. The murmurs in the cabin didn't stop. Passengers were still watching, still whispering, and somewhere in the background, a camera was still recording. His world had just flipped upside down. And the worst part? This moment wasn't going away. Greg Johnson stood there, frozen, his hands at his sides. His face was burning, his stomach in knots. The moment Senator Evelyn Carter spoke those words, he knew he had made the worst mistake of his career. Passengers were still watching. The businessman who had defended Maya gave him a disappointed glance before returning to his laptop. The woman in row 2 shook her head and whispered something to her husband. A few others exchanged looks, their expressions clear. They had seen everything. They knew exactly what had just happened. Greg looked toward the young flight attendant near the cockpit. She had gone to get the manager, and now he could hear footsteps approaching. This was getting worse by the second. Senator Carter sat beside Maya, her movements slow and controlled. She wasn't angry, not visibly, but the way she carried herself, the way she didn't need to raise her voice to command the entire room, made it clear that she wasn't letting this go. Greg cleared his throat. His voice came out weaker than he intended. "Senator Carter, I assure you, this was a misunderstanding." She didn't even blink. "A misunderstanding?" Greg forced a smile, trying to regain some control. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just wanted to confirm her seat." Senator Carter tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Greg, how many other passengers did you confirm before letting them sit?" Silence. Greg's mouth went dry. The senator leaned back in her seat. "Because from what I just heard, not a single person here was stopped except for my daughter." Greg felt his pulse quicken. "That's not, I wasn't. You assumed she didn't belong," she said, cutting him off. "And that assumption is the problem." Greg's chest tightened. He knew arguing wouldn't help, but something inside him refused to just stand there and take it. "Senator, I was just doing my job." Her eyes didn't leave his. "No, you weren't. Your job is to assist passengers, not humiliate them. Your job is to ensure safety, not make judgments based on who looks right for first class." The weight of her words pressed down on him. He wanted to deny it, to push back, but deep down, he knew she was right. More footsteps. A tall man in a dark uniform appeared, the flight manager. His eyes scanned the tense scene before landing on Greg. "What's going on here?" Before Greg could speak, the younger flight attendant jumped in. "There was an incident with a passenger." The manager frowned. "Senator Carter?" She nodded. "Your flight attendant assumed my daughter didn't belong in first class. He questioned her, dismissed her, and embarrassed her in front of everyone here." The manager's expression darkened. "Is that true?" Greg swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to." The manager raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Greg, step into the galley. Now." Greg hesitated. "But Now." He turned, his body stiff, and walked toward the front of the plane. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. The young flight attendant lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. Greg stepped into the small galley area, his heart pounding. The manager followed and shut the curtain behind them. "What were you thinking?" the manager hissed, his voice low but sharp. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Greg clenched his jaw. "It wasn't, you profiled a passenger, a senator's daughter, no less." The manager ran a hand over his face. "Do you know how bad this looks? There are cameras, Greg. Passengers were recording. This is going to be all over the internet in an hour." Greg's stomach twisted. He already knew that. The manager sighed. "I can't have this on my flight." Greg's breath caught. "What does that mean?" The manager's face was grim. "You're being removed from service for this flight. Gather your things." Greg stiffened. "Wait, you're pulling me off?" "You left me no choice," the manager said. "When we land, expect a formal review. If the airline decides this was misconduct, you know what that means." Greg's body went cold. He did know what that meant. His career, the job he had held for years, was on the line. He wanted to argue, to fight back, to insist that it wasn't his fault. But the truth was, he had done this to himself. Minutes later, Greg walked off the plane. As he passed the first-class cabin, he avoided looking at Maya and her mother, but he could feel their presence. He could feel the weight of his mistake. Passengers watched in silence as he exited, and just like that, his life changed in an instant. Because one assumption had just cost him everything. Greg stepped off the plane, his stomach in knots. The whispers from passengers still echoed in his head. He had never been removed from a flight before. His uniform felt too tight, his steps unsteady. The airport terminal was busy, but everything around him blurred. His mind was racing. What had just happened? A few hours ago, he had been confident, doing what he thought was his job. Now, he was the one being escorted off the plane. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. He already knew what the messages would say. His colleagues would be whispering. The passengers who had witnessed the incident would be talking. And online, the video of what he did was already spreading. Greg hurried toward the airline's staff office. He had already received a message from the supervisor. Report immediately. He knew what was coming. When he arrived, he barely had time to sit before the door opened. A woman in a sharp navy blue suit stepped out. Her expression was unreadable. "Greg Johnson?" He stood quickly. "Yes, come in." Greg followed her into the office, his heart pounding. The room was cold, the blinds half closed. He sat stiffly in the chair across from the desk, feeling exposed. The woman, his supervisor, sat down and studied him for a long moment. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. "I've reviewed the incident," she said finally. "I watched the video. I read the statements from passengers. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Greg swallowed. "I didn't mean—" "Stop." The supervisor raised a hand. "Think about what you're about to say. Are you going to defend yourself, or are you going to acknowledge what happened?" Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. He felt trapped. Every excuse would sound weak. The supervisor sighed and leaned forward. "Greg, I need you to answer something honestly. If that had been a young white woman in first class, would you have questioned her?" Greg's stomach twisted. "I don't treat people differently." She picked up her phone and pressed play. The video from the flight began to play, the exact moment he had stopped Maya, the way he had looked at her, the way his voice had carried through the cabin, the moment the businessman had spoken up. It was all there. Greg felt his face heat up. Seeing it from the outside made it worse. The supervisor paused the video. "Does this look like treating people the same to you?" Greg exhaled sharply. He had nothing to say. The supervisor folded her hands on the desk. "Senator Carter filed a formal complaint against you, not just as a mother, but as a public figure. Do you understand what that means?" Greg barely breathed. "It means this isn't going away." She nodded. "This is going to the airline's ethics board. They'll determine whether you violated anti-discrimination policies. And if they rule against you..." Greg swallowed hard. "I lose my job." She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. Silence stretched between them. Greg clenched his fists. He had worked in this job for years. He had seen all kinds of passengers, dealt with difficult situations. But today, he had been the problem. And now, he was facing the consequences. His mind raced for a way out. "Can I talk to the senator?" The supervisor gave him a look. "What exactly do you think that will accomplish?" Greg hesitated. "I just want to apologize. I didn't mean to offend her daughter." The supervisor exhaled. "Greg, listen carefully. This isn't just about Maya. This is about a pattern, a mindset that made you believe even for a second that a young black girl couldn't be a first-class passenger. Greg lowered his gaze. He hated the way that sounded, but deep down, he knew it was true. The supervisor leaned back in her chair. You have two options. One, you fight this, go public, claim it was all a misunderstanding. You might get some people to defend you, but the video is out there. You'll never escape it. Greg's hands felt clammy. And the other option? The supervisor slid a folder across the desk. He hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a list of programs: diversity training, bias awareness workshops, community outreach events. You take accountability, she said. You go through these programs. You show that you're willing to learn. That this wasn't just about one mistake, but about changing how you see the world. Greg stared at the folder. His pride told him to reject it, to say he had done nothing wrong. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about one bad moment. It was about how he had viewed people his entire life. He thought back to the way he had dismissed Maya, the way he had smirked, so sure of himself. He had done it without thinking, and that was the worst part. Now, he had a choice to make. Greg lifted his head. If I do this, do I get to keep my job? The supervisor studied him. That's up to the board. Greg nodded slowly. His career was hanging by a thread. He wasn't sure if it was even salvageable. But the real question was, did he actually want to change? Or did he just want to save himself? That was something no training program could decide for him. He closed the folder. I'll do it. The supervisor nodded. Good. Because whether or not you keep this job, you need to figure out who you really are. Greg didn't argue. He just stood, the folder in his hands. As he walked out of the office, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same. Greg stepped out of the office, gripping the folder tightly. His mind was spinning. He had just agreed to go through training, but he wasn't sure if it was because he wanted to change or because he had no other choice. As he walked down the hall, he heard whispers from other airline staff. He caught a few glances in his direction, some filled with disappointment, others with quiet judgment. He wasn't just another employee anymore. He was the guy who got pulled off a flight for discrimination. His phone buzzed again. He finally pulled it out. The notifications were endless. Trending. Now. Flight attendant profiles senator's daughter. Instant regret. Comments. How many times does this happen to people who don't have powerful parents? This isn't about one mistake. It's about how bias works. Greg scrolled through the comments, his stomach tightening. No one was defending him. He had convinced himself that people would understand, that they'd see it as just a misunderstanding. But they didn't, because it wasn't just about him. It was about a system that let this happen over and over again. He leaned against the wall, exhaling. He had spent years believing that he was fair, that he treated people equally, but now he was forced to admit that he never truly questioned his own biases. For the first time, he wondered how many other people he had treated like Maya without even realizing it. A voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Greg. He looked up. The supervisor had returned, standing a few feet away. There's someone who wants to speak with you. Greg tensed. Who? The supervisor didn't answer. She simply nodded toward a nearby conference room. The door was slightly open. Inside, someone was waiting. Greg hesitated, then walked toward the door. When he stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. Senator Evelyn Carter was sitting at the table. She looked just as composed as she had on the plane. Calm, collected, powerful. Greg's pulse quickened. What was she doing here? She gestured to the seat across from her. Sit. Greg sat, feeling like a child being called into the principal's office. The senator folded her hands. "Tell me, Greg, why are you here?" Greg swallowed. "The airline is reviewing my case." She nodded. "And what do you think they'll decide?" Greg hesitated. He wanted to say he wasn't sure, but the truth was he knew. His career was hanging by a thread. "They might fire me," he admitted. The senator studied him. "And if they do, will you blame them? Or will you blame yourself?" Greg opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. He wanted to say he had been treated unfairly, that this had all been blown out of proportion. But deep down, he knew the truth. "I messed up," he said quietly. The senator tilted her head. "Do you understand why?" Greg hesitated again. "Because I assumed Maya wasn't supposed to be in first class." She nodded. "And why did you assume that?" Greg's hands tightened into fists. "I don't know." The senator leaned forward slightly. "Yes, you do." Greg's face burned. He did know. He just didn't want to say it out loud. After a long silence, he exhaled. "Because when I saw her, I didn't think she looked like she belonged." The words felt heavy, but saying them made him realize how true they were. Senator Carter watched him for a moment, then said, "What would you have done if Maya had been my son instead?" "A young black man?" Greg's chest tightened. He didn't want to answer that question. The senator didn't let him off the hook. "Would you have been more suspicious, more aggressive?" Greg swallowed hard. He couldn't deny it. He had worked plenty of flights. He had seen young black men in hoodies before, and every time something inside him tensed. He had told himself it was just about following procedure. But now he saw it for what it was: bias. He had never questioned it. Not until today. Senator Carter finally leaned back. "I don't care about an apology, Greg. I care about what happens next." Greg looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the folder on the table. "You say you'll take the training, but do you actually want to learn from it? Or do you just want to fix your reputation?" Greg's stomach twisted. That was the real question, wasn't it? Would he actually change? Or was he just trying to survive this scandal? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try." The senator studied him. Then, slowly, she nodded. "That's a start." Greg exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. He had walked into this room expecting a confrontation. Instead, he had been forced to confront himself. Senator Carter stood. "Whatever happens with your job, that's out of my hands. But if you really want to change, it has to be for the right reasons." Greg stood too, still feeling unsteady. "How do I do that?" The senator gave him a small, knowing smile. "You listen, you learn. And next time, before you make an assumption, you stop and think." She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Just before she left, she turned back. "Good luck, Greg." And then she was gone. Greg sat back down, staring at the folder in front of him. The reality of everything weighed on him. For years, he had thought he was one of the good guys, that he treated everyone fairly. But today, he had learned that bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, unnoticed, until it ruins someone's day or their career. He didn't know what the future held. But one thing was clear. He wasn't the same person he had been before that flight. And now, it was up to him to decide who he would be moving forward. Greg sat alone in the empty conference room, staring at the folder in front of him. His hands rested on the table, fingers lightly tapping the cover. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a choice. For years, he had believed he was fair, that he treated people equally. But today, he had been forced to face the truth. He had never questioned his own assumptions until now. He didn't know if he could fix everything. He didn't know if people would ever see him differently, but one thing was certain. He had to change, not for his job, not to protect his reputation, but because he finally saw the problem. And now, it was up to him to do something about it. But here's the real question. Do you think people like Greg deserve a second chance? Can someone truly change, or do actions like his define a person forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Because conversations like this, they need to happen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.